I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, a vile occurrence on college campuses in our country, initiated by the insidious brown shirt efforts of the BDS movement that is seeking to destroy the state of Israel through economic and cultural boycotts, economic divestment, and economic and cultural sanctions against the Jewish state. This month, on various American college campuses, there's something called Israeli Apartheid Week. Israeli Apartheid Week on college campuses in our country. Oases of academic knowledge, places supposedly dedicated to truth and the discussion of ideas. But no, it's Israeli Apartheid Week, an attempt to delegitimize the state of Israel by suggesting it is guilty of the same kind of apartheid segregation, discrimination, and persecution that existed in white-controlled South Africa. Well, there are some in the Jewish community who are speaking out loudly and strongly against this vile attempt to delegitimize Israel. And one of the most articulate voices in this war against evil is the voice of Ruth Wisse, Professor Emerita of Yiddish Literature and Comparative Literature at Harvard University. And she's also written extensively on the nature and threats of a resurgent anti-Semitism, of which the BDS movement is a major force. And Ruth Wisse just published an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal featuring a photo of the Israeli Apartheid Week wall at Columbia University. And I'm so pleased to have on our JBS phones now Ruth Wisse. Ruth, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Mark. Thank you for having me.
Ruth, it's a wonderful piece you wrote for the Wall Street Journal. By the way, how widespread is Israeli Apartheid Week?
Well, it's a very good question. It depends very much on the individual campuses. Their website claims 150 colleges in America. It's nothing like that, I don't think. But, for example, there have been such weeks at Harvard occasionally and not so in other years. So it's a kind of a wave that goes from one campus to another.
Yes.
And the defamation involved in this and the threat involved in this is obviously greater than the occurrence itself, because it is made known that this is going to happen. Jewish students get very upset about it, defensive about it. There are preparations on the campus. Announcements are made of it. So it's very, it's difficult to answer the question because it is not just a statistical phenomenon, how many people participate or how many campuses it occurs on. The idea is that every year this does occur on a great many campuses, and so the threat that it may come to you this year or next year is always there. It's a menace. It's always in the air, and I think that is as important a strategy of the movement as the phenomenon itself when it does occur.
Now, did you say you experienced either this particular thing or something like it at Harvard?
Yes, there was once in the Israel Apartheid Week, at least once that I remember at Harvard. I don't know whether it's there this year. I don't think so. Other things take its place sometimes. But definitely it did come to Harvard at some point.
Okay.
And, of course, the students get agitated.
Yes. I do not want to ask this question in a simplistic way. And having you to talk to gives me an opportunity to ask the question, I believe, the way it should be asked. You heard me say in the open, we have an idealized vision of what university life is like. certainly when we're talking about the Ivy Leagues, when we're talking about Harvard or Columbia or Yale, let alone Rutgers, where your piece says that's where this week of Israel Apartheid Week will end. But can you explain, you experienced it, Ruth, can you explain how it happens that in the halls of academia, and I should point out your piece stresses that there is a lot of BDS that comes out of the academic world, out of the professors at esteemed universities. Can you explain to me, as you saw this get more and pick up more and more steam, what motivates professors on college campuses, do you believe, what's really behind the fact that they are so anti-Israel and would participate either in the BDS movement in general or something like Apartheid Week, Israeli Apartheid Week in particular? What's the genesis of it? What drives it, do you think, Ruth?
Well, Mark, if we were to go into this, we would have to probably go back hundreds of years and at least 150 years or more for the genesis of the movement that you're describing. There are many features involved. I would like to begin, though, by making some kind of distinctions here. You're talking not about something which is being generated by the universities. To my knowledge, there isn't a single university in the United States of America, certainly not the elite universities, and certainly not most of the universities that have been targeted by the BDS movement, that have any interest in furthering this or in even allowing it to take place. This never begins with the administration. It doesn't really begin with what you could call the university. And in every case, I think, that we know of, when it's drawn to the attention of the administrators, it makes them uncomfortable, it makes them uneasy, in some cases it makes them angry. So this isn't a function of the universities. Mm-hmm. It's not top-down. Mm-hmm. This is a movement which begins from below. It's a movement of grievance and blame. My definition of anti-Semitism is the organization of politics against the Jews. Yes. And it's the organization of politics against the Jews and what the Jews represent, because there's always something more at stake. They say, it's about Jews, it's about Israel, and so on, but you can see from the coalitions that form that this is basically an anti-movement, A-N-T-I. It's against. It's a movement of protest. It's a movement of, as you say, delegitimation, but also delegitimation of what the Western values and the Western civilization that Israel represents, precisely what we sometimes think to be the most positive values of Western civilization, namely the desire for coexistence, the desire for, real toleration of individuals and toleration of groups. These are things which are not universally desirable. And we know that there are many societies where, in fact, there is a great resistance to the principles of individual liberties and human rights as they are actually practiced, right, and freedom of association and freedom of speech. There are many societies that are opposed to that. Yes. So I think that the generative force of this is, of course, the Arab students on campus who coalesce around the idea that Israel has oppressed the Palestinians. This has been the war against Israel, the Arab war against Israel dates from even before the creation of the State of Israel. Yes. And it picks up its own kind of momentum. Now, many years ago already, Arab governments subsidized the students who were coming to Canada and to the United States to study at universities, subsidized them, encouraged them to do anti-Israel propaganda on campus. And this has really become bigger and bigger, and it's now taken on a life of its own. And I think the most dangerous point came when a coalition was formed between various leftist groups and some minority groups and the Palestinian groups, where they saw that they could be bigger than they were if they were not just a Palestinian-based movement, but if they could become a larger protest movement. And so what you see is that this mushrooms or snowballs or, picks up momentum because of the various disaffected groups on campus that become involved in this. And that's what it is that happens at the student level.
Yes. We'll get back to the professors in one moment. I just want to make sure we understand each other. Are you saying to me that you've heard of no university being willing to divest from Israel because of the BDS movement?
That is right.
Okay.
I don't know of a single movement, a single university that has actually divested from.
Okay, it's
Israel.
a very important.
There have been little strategic things, for example, to try to get the dining room services to stop using SodaStream. You see, so sometimes it's not leveled at the full university level to divest, but just to go into the dining services and to say stop using this. There, I cannot tell you definitively that there's not a single case where this hasn't worked. But if you're talking about the divestment at the university level, I know of no single case where this has been effective.
Okay, we've been paying a lot of attention to this lately. And many people like yourself in the Jewish community, Jewish world, are speaking out against what's going on college campuses. Naomi Vilko, who is profoundly involved with JBS, along with Denny Ayalon, has been speaking repeatedly about this everywhere in the tri-state area. Denny Ayalon goes all over the country. Erwin Kotler, who of course is a dear friend of yours, and recently Erwin was part of an afternoon that you and I participated in as well on global anti-Semitism at Kean University. He's involved with it very much. To what extent do you feel, Ruth, that while universities may not be involved in the BDS movement, again, on a university level in terms of administration, do you feel they are doing enough? Are university administrations doing enough to, A, combat this kind of insidious movement, or to somehow both protect and make the life of Jewish students on campus more palatable?
Well, it's a very good question, Mark, but I think that if you're talking about the university's responsibility as opposed to faculty and so forth as individuals, I would say that the real outrage has been in Middle East studies. And Martin Kramer wrote a very important book about this, Ivory Tower and then Sand, many years ago, pointing out that the Middle East studies, the field of Middle East studies, is in many ways scandalous. And as a result of how corrupted it became, in fact, a counter-organization was formed by Bernard Lewis and others, and it was formed in order to be a counter force to the Middle East, the regular Middle East Studies Association.
Yes.
Because it was felt that the whole association itself was sort of it was the basis of everything else. So I would say that as far as the responsibility of the universities goes, they are really accountable for not having been able to do the work of proper teaching, proper instruction. You began with that when you were introducing the subject, and I think you're perfectly right. But I would make that really the basis of the community's protest, because here you see so much more is at stake. It's not just a question of Israel or the Jews. If the entire Middle East is being mistaught, if the right questions are not being raised and the wrong questions are being pursued, if there is no attempt made to understand what is going on in the Middle East, then year after year, there is less and less effective teaching of the one subject or one of the few subjects in world affairs that are most important
Absolutely.
for American students to know.
Absolutely.
Right?
Ruth,
yeah.
what is the right question? What question do you wish was asked and studied more?
Well, the roots of terrorism, for example, the roots of anti-Semitism. The real question, for example, is why is it that the Arab League was organized in 1945 against the creation of the State of Israel? What forces were at work in the Arab world that could not accept the principle of coexistence? Why could the Arab world not accept the principle of coexistence? Because the war against Israel is not a war against Israel per se. It's a war against the principle of coexistence. It's a war against the principle of regional toleration, and you see how that has escalated.
Absolutely.
Since
Absolutely.
1945. It's become more and more pathological,
Yes.
more and more destructive of the societies that have refused to accept this principle.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that the real questions are, what is the political organization of these Arab societies? Why are they so resistant to creative reform? Why have things gotten so much worse over the years? What are the forces that are so debilitating to them? How could these things be, changed and altered? And so these are the questions. The more emphasis that Middle East studies places on the iniquity of Israel, the less it is dealing with the real questions of the area. You see what I mean? It's
Absolutely.
It's all a question of raising. You see, talking about Israel's misdeeds or Israel's mistakes or Israel's whatever it is. It's a very convenient way of removing the focus from really problematic questions. Because
Very
I think that the question of the self-reform and of the Arab world and of Muslim societies is the crucial question of the next few centuries.
It is not politically correct to frame it as you've just framed it, Ruth.
Well, the thing is, political correctness aside, I think that there are truths that everybody recognizes.
Of course.
You no sooner have to say something like this, and there's nobody who's going to deny it. You just have to pick up the paper any given time, unfortunately, and the truth is just there.
Well, it
cannot be concealed.
Good for you. Another one of your colleagues, Charles Small, has been active also in terms of trying to combat anti-Semitism in academia. You also know he was thrown out of Yale because Yale seemed to feel that they didn't want a group dealing with anti-Semitism that really asked the kind of questions you believe are at the heart of the conflict at the moment. And at ISGAP, which is Charles Small's organization, they were asking these kind of questions all the time. I want to give you a chance, by the way, to address, it comes out of your article, a key question. Many people, Ruth, don't really understand what apartheid is. They know the word, they know it's bad. They don't understand what it is or why the term has no relevance at all for anything related to the State of Israel. Would you speak for a moment? What is apartheid, what the word signifies, and why does it not apply to Israel's treatment of Palestinians either in Israel proper or on the West Bank?
Well, two things here. So just strategically, Mark, it's interesting that you put the question. One of the things that I do is I refuse in any kind of discussion of this question to defend the State of Israel or to explain the State of Israel in terms of an accusation against it. So you're not, I hardly say that you're the one who's mounting this accusation. But let's say somebody were to ask me this question confrontationally, what about Israel's apartheid
Yes.
and so on?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I once said is, why did you kill your grandmother? I once said this at a public evening, when an Arab student confronted me about Israel's apartheid. I said, why did you kill your grandmother? And, he thought I was crazy. And he said, no, you didn't hear my question. I said, yes, I heard your question. You didn't hear my question.
Brilliant.
I'm asking you, why did you do this?
Brilliant.
Because the point is, you see, and then I turned to the room and I said, look, can this person prove to me that he did not do this? And if I raise the question to him, you see, immediately it puts him on the defensive, and then he has to react to this absolutely preposterous question. So strategically, I only raise this with you because this would be my strategy.
Good for you.
That you do not, if you respond to a question that is obviously malicious in intent, then you have to spend, 15 minutes, 20 minutes explaining that Israel, has these policies, how many Arabs actually live wonderfully in Israel, what Israel's policies towards its citizens are. Like, for example, just today I saw, how many Christians were able to celebrate Easter in Israel, whereas they're not able to celebrate Easter anywhere else. There's no shortage of proofs of Israel's greatness and tolerance and everything else. It's just that I want to make the point that Israel is not being criticized. It is being blamed. Mm-hmm. And when you are put in the defendant's box, the minute you agree to be the defendant, that's who you are, the defendant. And my point would be that Israel is not the defendant. Israel should be the prosecution, right? Israel has something to prosecute. The Arab world did not simply accept the legitimacy, the reality, the obviousness of the creation of the Jewish state. What right did they have not to accept it? There's no right. The United Nations demanded that they accept it, and yet they refused to. So I would say that one should never, even in one's mind, in any such conversation, agree to play the role of the defendant. Getting back to your question, I would say that the apartheid analogy, if it applies, of course, applies to the Arab world's refusal to accept the Jews.
Yes.
Right? The fact that the Jews function very well is fine and well, but that doesn't really explain why they put up this wall, why they insisted on destroying. The only reason the wall is there is because of their destructive intention.
Yes.
So, in fact, it is, projecting onto the Jews their own iniquities, their own crime.
That is really brilliant, Ruth, and I've never heard anyone express it that way or certainly nearly as well. So, kol hakavod to you. We only have a few moments left. I want to come around to a different attitude. I want you to talk about what you feel is being done on college campuses to successfully defeat the entire mentality that would suggest Israel is apartheid or that would support BDS. And in your piece in the Wall Street Journal, you talk about Connecticut College and Israel on Campus Coalition. Talk for one more moment now about what you've seen happen at Connecticut College and what you feel in general is being done that gives you some sense of optimism.
Well, it's an interesting that you mentioned Connecticut College, because as a result of the column, I did get a call actually from Connecticut College, from the administration there, and they pointed out to me something that I had known actually, that the reason that Professor Pessin, who is mentioned in my article, is not at the college this year is not because they fired him. she made clear, but because he had to take a leave of absence, and that they are very proud of him, that he's considered to be a very good professor, and that he will be back there next year. Why do I mention this? Because obviously the pressure that was put on them by drawing attention to what happened to him made a difference. So it was very hard on him. I think
now,
that
we make sure the audience knows he criticized Hamas, correct?
He criticized Hamas, and one of the students who heard him criticize Hamas began to use social media against him,
yes,
saying that what he said about Hamas is the way he feels about all Palestinians and about Arabs, and that he is a racist. And she used this term against him. And instead of coming to his defense, the difficulty arises not just the students mounted this attack on him, but his own department refused to come to his defense on this. You know, you would think that they would automatically rise to his defense, but they didn't. And so the thing escalated until it got out of hand. And at that point, I mean, he just felt that he was under assault, and so he has taken a leave from the university. Now I think the university, as a result of the bad press that they have received from all kinds of organizations which are forming, yes, things like the Academic Council for Israel, the Academic Engagement Network, the Louis Brandeis Center for Human Rights, the AMCHA initiative, and some of the ones you've mentioned. And I would say one of the most effective really is also the NGO Monitor, which also monitors the BDS movement. All these movements that try to find legal means of undermining and attacking BDS on its own ground for its illegalities. I think that those are really very effective movements.
That is a wonderful summary. I love talking to you, and I'll say this again. You say things that need to be heard, which nobody is saying. I have enormous regard for you and appreciation for you, and I want you in studio so we can sit together at L'Chaim for an hour. I hope you'll let me set that up.
Well, thanks very much, Mark. Thanks for what you do, and thanks for drawing attention to these things.
Thank you.
It's really much appreciated.
All the best to you. We'll talk soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
All
you.
right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. The thoughts of Ruth Wisse, Professor Emerita of Yiddish Literature and Comparative Literature at Harvard University. And so when somebody says, explain, justify for me that Israel is an apartheid state, she says back to them, tell me why you murdered your grandmother. A very interesting approach. And her point is, both are ludicrous. It is ludicrous to say that Israel is an apartheid state. And I love her perspective. Israel should not accept ever, and no defender of Israel should somehow take the role of the defendant. In fact, Israel has nothing to defend, and all of us should be extolling the tremendous contribution Israel makes, not only to the world, not only to the Jewish people, but to the Arab world that lives in Israel and to some extent lives on the West Bank. My thanks, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, to our production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, to the JBS Associate Director, Dara Golub, and to the producers of this edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal and Jan Weiss. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.